I'm Anita Huberman. As you all know, I'm CEO of the Surrey Board of Trade. We're on the unceded territory of our Coast Salish people, specifically Kwantlen, Katzie, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen nations. And I just wanted to let you know that a roundtable at the Surrey Board of Trade is a little bit different than our large town hall events that we have. This is a chance for you, as I indicate when you can speak, to really articulate any comments that you have or any ideas for our guest of honor this morning. And we have 1 hour with her to really articulate any feedback you have within the budget or anything related to her ministerial critic role for gender equity, accessibility, and inclusion. And it's my pleasure to welcome Stephanie Cadieux. And she is an MLA here in South Surrey. And we all know that Surrey is going to be the largest city in British Columbia very soon. And we need to ensure that we have the investments on this side of the river for our city in all aspects related to the economic paradigm, but also the social paradigm, which has an economic lens as well. So Stephanie, over to you first for your opening remarks, and then we'll go into the roundtable.
Thank you. Hope we don't have HD TV because I feel like I've got a hair in my eyes. Thanks for having me. It's great to see everybody. A lot of familiar faces on the screen this morning. And Anita, congratulations on your anniversary. Happy anniversary. I am really quite jazzed about this new portfolio. I've held a lot of roles in my time, my 12 years in government, cabinet roles on community citizen services and social services and children and families, as everyone will likely remember. And through that time, I've had the opportunity to always bring an accessibility lens, a disability lens to the cabinet table over those years, but with the focus largely being directly related to my ministerial duties, I didn't have the opportunity, as much as I might have liked, to press specifically on issues related to advancement of women, women in leadership, and accessibility and inclusion in its broadest forms. So I'm really excited now as Critic to leave behind perhaps the more public roles of Critic for Finance or ICBC, to really actually focus in on what I am most passionate about, and that is women in the workforce, gender equity, and inclusion. So I'm really excited. The other nice thing about these things is they're things that I think most people can support. So it's not as important for this to be an aggressive role. This is about things that largely all parties in government agree on. So I have the opportunity to press and critique and encourage, but we are largely, I think, moving in the same direction. And over the last number of years, I introduced pay equity legislation in a couple of forms a number of times, because I feel it's a direction we need to take as a province. And I was pleased in the election to hear that the NDP government was intending to introduce similar legislation. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. I don't know when that's coming. And accessibility legislation is something that obviously I've been looking for a long time. Back in 2014, our government at the time launched Accessibility 2024, which was a large public campaign to talk to people with disabilities and the advocates that support them and their allies, to talk about what needed to change, what was the work still to be done, and there's certainly lots of it. But it was an opportunity to sort of highlight 12 building blocks, as we called them, in areas where there were things government could do to encourage and improve access and inclusion. And we got part way, and one of those things was the commitment to accessibility legislation. However, since the federal government was moving forward with similar legislation, we decided to wait until after that legislation was public so that we could build upon it and not work at cross purposes, which I think was a good idea. I'm pleased that the NDP has continued on with the plan to introduce legislation, and I understand that it was ready in the fall. So I'm hoping that we're going to see it in the legislature in March. So a lot of what I'm doing right now is reaching out to groups both in the gender equity and women's serving organizations and the access and inclusion and disability community to reach out, reconnect, connect in this different way with organizations and people that I've known and worked with for many years, but to ask questions about what are the expectations of those organizations of government? What are they hoping government's going to move forward on? What are they hoping to see in the short term? What are their biggest current issues or concerns? And how can I be helpful? So certainly as it relates to accessibility legislation, that is probably the most pressing because I do expect we're going to see that this spring. So I want to be able to bring the broadest set of voices to the table as I can in the debate to ensure that that legislation meets the sort of desires and intents of people in the community to actually make change. So that's a bit about me and the role for now, and I welcome questions and comments and a good dialogue today.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. So ladies and gentlemen, now it's over to you to provide your comments, your perspectives, your ideas to Stephanie as it relates to her portfolio or anything related to BC government investments that are important in your area of expertise and of course to our city of Surrey. And this time, Stephanie, I'm going to speak last because I have a list of ideas and perspectives that I'd like to get your feedback on as well. So I ask all of you when I call your name just to keep your ideas and your comments very succinct and respectful. So we will begin with Dave Hare, and then we'll go to Nate Toves and then Merlin.
Yes, good morning, everyone. And again, congratulations, Anita, on your working anniversary of 30 years with Surrey Board of Trade. Now, Stephanie, one of the things when I talk to many people, one of the simple things is the housing. We all live in the housing, and it's very easy to fix when you're building new houses to make them more accessible. And sadly enough, after so long, most of the houses are not accessible a person with the difficulty. My father used to be in a wheelchair, and so I understand it because of a long time, and which is very easy to do. And province can tell the municipalities, you know, this is when you're constructing the home, it's very easy to do. And second thing is gender equity. I agree with 100%. I think sadly enough, even though we talked about it for many decades now, right? It's not there. I'm glad you put your bill forward, and hopefully the NDP will put forward. I think in 2021, it should be all about having gender equity. I remember with the Rotary clubs at one time, only men were allowed to be members. Back in 1989, they changed that around the world. So everybody can join the membership. If Rotary can move, who is so difficult organization to change, even when Margaret Thatcher went to speak in there, she could not join as a member, but as a Prime Minister, she could speak in there. So I hope things change. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. And yeah, you really hit the nail on the head with those comments. But some people, and I know Dave will be aware that I introduced legislation on accessible housing a number of times over the last number of years as well. And I know some advocates will say, well, why didn't you do it while you're in government? And that's the general pushback. Well, frankly, I was working on it. It's a moving policy in government is a long process. While government can move fast sometimes, not always effectively, generally it moves slowly. And I was moving these agenda items along and had hoped to be bringing them forward in legislation. But instead did that with a private member's bill. The reality is that we aren't building housing that works for everybody. And when we talk about accessibility and inclusion, though it's fascinating to me that as a society, we recognize that people should have access to public spaces, but never dealt with the fact that they may not have access to their own home. And that really concerns me. It concerns me as well that often governments and agencies define the need for accessible housing or confine the need for accessible housing to government subsidized housing. It's not, that would never be achievable, given that 20% of the population has some form of disability affecting their mobility. So the reality is you're not going to build and fund government housing for everyone. That isn't reasonable, or I don't think what anybody is wanting. What we do need is to recognize that the first place people need to be able to access is a home, and that home might change at different points in life depending on jobs, where people want to live or go to school, when people marry or have children, or when they retire. People move. But right now, for people with disabilities, they're lucky to have a place they can independently access at all. Most are living in accommodations that are not ideal, some even unsafe, but because of the cost of renovating and adapting existing housing stock, they are stuck. That means that a lot of people miss out on a lot of things. It means grandparents miss out on family dinners because they can't, their wheelchairs can't be brought into a home with stairs. It means that kids don't get to go to birthday parties and sleepovers and play at their friend's house because their friend's house is not accessible. It means that families are financially pinched because they didn't anticipate having a child who was born with or acquired a disability requiring modifications to a home that can cost upward of $100,000 to do it minimally. And the reality is that there's lots of us, 60% of the population of people with disabilities at least, that are financially independent, that look after themselves, that work, that whose families are supporting a person with a disability. And they want to be able to search for a home in the market like anybody else. So it's important that we start building housing that works for everyone across the lifespan. And that doesn't mean something that's ugly or looks like a hospital. That means something that's thoughtful, that people have put into the planning stage the reality that you need to have a level entry, you need to have access to a washroom that has sufficient room to turn a wheelchair, and so minimally is visitable. Ideally, we move beyond that and look to build things that are accessible or adaptable, meaning that you don't build 3-story townhome complexes where there are stairs to access all aspects of a home. It means you have to allow for parking, because likely if somebody's using a power wheelchair, or a wheelchair, they're also needing a van, which means they need somewhere to park that. So there's a need to do a lot more. Some municipalities have done some work in this area. I would argue there is not any jurisdiction in Canada that has done a good job. And that's why I think it's time for the provincial government to step in and set some guidelines. Out here in South Surrey, where I am, many of you will know, there are about 10,000 units of housing going in right now. Not one is one I can even visit. I am completely blocked from that market with my dollars. My husband and I did an experiment a couple of years ago where we called all of the new housing developers that were putting up, whether that be single family homes or condos, townhouses. And we asked if they would modify a plan at our expense to be wheelchair accessible. The answer from all but one was no. Now, at the time, I wasn't interested in taking them to the Human Rights Tribunal or otherwise forcing the issue, because it was largely an experiment at the time and we're happy in our home. But it flagged for me a real issue, because we at some point are going to want to move, and there is nothing to move to. So I'm hopeful that government will consider this as a part of the legislation moving forward on accessibility and adapting the building code to include housing. So that was a long-winded answer, I'm sorry.
So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Nate and Marlene, and then Stephanie, you can respond to those two.
Sure.
Nate, over to you.
Hey, Stephanie, great to see you. So lots of activity, and rightly so, in the press about Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter, and these are important conversations. But disability doesn't care, right? Disability doesn't care what your race is, or whether you're religious or not, or what God you pray to or don't, or what your socioeconomic status is, or any of that. And disability, as you earlier said, is the one thing that binds us all together. And if you live long enough, you're likely to have a disability of some sort, one way or the other. And, you know, Stephanie, what is it going to take so that in government, it isn't a conversation that's brought up when it has to be brought up, when there's somebody that's willing to be loud enough to make the news people stand up and listen? When is it just going to be something that we're just going to do it because it's the smart thing to do? It isn't the right thing to do because of charity. It's none of that. It's like hiring people with disabilities isn't about charity. It's about, it's good for business. There's a business case to be made. When are the smart people with all the money that do the developments and the housing figure out that this can be done? And it doesn't, as you've said, it doesn't really cost more if you do it from the start. What's it going to take for that needle to be moved?
Okay, Marlene.
Thank you, Anita, for hosting this, and hello, Stephanie. Lovely to see you. My question, I think we see a theme here. Mine is really about how do we go from bootstrapping to investment, and investment means funding. So at KPU, we're very, very proud that after a 5-year pilot project, we have 3 students with intellectual disabilities who participated fully in a credential bearing program, and no accommodations. They will get the same credential that everybody else gets. But that was 5 years of funding from a number of sources, including the KPU Foundation. And we don't at this point have the ability to keep that going and to spread it and to you know, stretch that approach across the university yet. And it's going to take investment to make that happen. So you know, while some things can happen organically, I think what we're hearing is you know, the housing issue, education, those kinds of things are going to take investment. And so what kind of approach do we need to take collaboratively to get the wheels? Because if the policy piece takes a long time, we know that the funding piece is going to take even longer. And we need to start those conversations sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Well, both good questions or comments. I think it will take a shift, a cosmic shift. But at the same time, I think maybe now is the time. I'm hopeful now is the time. The federal government passed their legislation a couple of years ago. We're going to hopefully pass some legislation here, which will have impact. And I'm hoping that that legislation will indeed have impact. And by that, I mean, set the bar at the height that says, there is now a lens on everything. Figure it out. It isn't okay for this to be an afterthought. I think that is what we are hoping for largely from the legislation in the community. Easier said than done, of course, but the federal government's legislation did kind of set a standard, and it'll take time to move everybody there. But people are starting to awaken, and there are things that can be done that don't cost money. There are things that are strictly a decision that has to be made in terms of policy, and there are things that undoubtedly cost money. But governments make those decisions all the time. So that it is about this becoming an understood requirement. Just like with the building code, over time we did the LEED process to try and improve environmental sustainability Well, there's no difference with including accessibility. It just has to be made the rule. Nobody wants to step out on a limb outside of the norm and do something somebody else hasn't done because it might cost them. It might take away from competitive advantage. I would argue completely the opposite. It's all a competitive advantage if you do it, but it's a difficult argument to make. I'll give you an example. A number of years ago, I went to a new hotel, brand new, pretty good accessibility, generally. I saw the rooms. The showers had no seats. Right wheel and shower with nowhere to sit. I had to explain why that was problematic, and they had to bring in a solution. I also asked, why is it that all of your rooms for people with disabilities are the same? What if they were single rooms? What if a family wanted to stay, or two friends? Why don't they have the same options that others who book rooms have? Why isn't there an accessible suite? Why is it that an assumption is made that people with disabilities will only stay in the least expensive room? And ultimately the decision, or the commentary back from the hotelier was, people with disabilities aren't our market. To which I asked, who is your market? And they said, business travelers. And I said, well, I travel 4 days a week for business. And the cabinet of British Columbia at the time didn't stay anywhere I couldn't stay. And they sort of hummed and hawed a moment. They said, well, but we're really more of an artsy hotel. We cater to a sort of arts and culture crowd. And I said, well, I'm the president of a theater company that just toured a production across Canada. I am your market. I am your market in every sense of the word, but you have built to exclude me. And it was an interesting conversation, because what it reinforced for me was that the world sees disability as a discrete group. The world sees disability as something one has to directly cater to, and that all of these people are a homogeneous mix of people that all want the same things, need the same things, choose the same things, do things together. They don't see us as people who visit restaurants, as people who go to work every day, as people who drive cars, as people who ride transit, as people who travel, as people who go to the doctor, to the movies. But the reality is that we have to shift the thinking. Disability is a subset of every single market. We are 20% of every single market, whether that be employees, whether that be travelers, whether it be patrons of businesses. We are 20%. And if you are not prepared for that 20%, then you're missing out on that 20% and actively excluding them. That's the conversation we have to have. That's where we have to get people's minds to go. And that's when we'll start realizing that there's an economic imperative to doing this work.
Our next three speakers, Greg Thomas, Linda McCrossan, and then Tomas Ray. Greg.
Yep, thank you. Great to see you, Stephanie. Thank you for joining us today. I could say a lot of things. I'll try and keep my comments relatively brief. You've touched on a number of things that are really important. I just want to touch on one of them related again to housing. You talk about accessibility with housing, but there's also accessibility in the workplace. And as you've just mentioned, people with disabilities, whether it's vision, hearing, medical disabilities, mobility issues, they're being excluded from the workforce for a variety of reasons, and access is one of them. I think of my own building and the challenges that people have there. And, you know, even anybody that's worked with a senior understands many of the challenges that you're talking about. So I think there is a big push to really be addressing workplace accessibility. That would be one. I want to touch as well on gender parity, and I guess we could include inclusion in there as well, cultural inclusion, Aboriginal inclusion as well. one of the issues that business faces, and I guess it's communities overall, but certainly businesses, and you can take it into the boardroom if you want, but you could expand it out to the workforce, is education. There just simply is not an understanding or a knowledge of what inclusion means or what the challenges are to gender parity or Aboriginal issues or cultural sensitivity, new immigrants. I mean, the list is almost endless. And so I find that where we are in society right now, we need more than just simple corporate training. We actually need to reevaluate actually how we present this information to our children, our youth, all the way through up to the business communities now, so that sitting around a corporate board, it's not simply people that are saying, yes, I guess we need to have, an Aboriginal person representing business sitting on our board, or we need somebody from the immigration community sitting on our board, because, frankly, that's almost on the edge of tokenism, where we're doing it simply to be seen as doing the right thing instead of doing the right thing for the right reason. And that comes with an actual knowledge and understanding. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Zero conference that happens every year in Vienna. Over 100 countries are represented there, and they talk about zero barriers for people with disabilities. And at that conference this year, it was all virtual, of course. It was all about using artificial intelligence and innovation to reduce barriers for employment. And some of these things are absolutely mind-blowing. So I have a tremendous amount of hope moving forward, but obviously many people have for decades, and we still don't change a lot. And I agree with you that in many cases it's not an organic change. It has to be a legislated change in order to just simply make things happen. So I'm going to stop there, but I really wanted to emphasize that these barriers and these challenges for us and the ability to move forward on it, I think is really rooted in a cultural or societal shift that we really have to somehow address in a much larger way. We are now, and I would almost say that COVID in some respects has lowered a lot of the barriers for people, because many people are working from home now that traditionally wouldn't. It's also introduced some new barriers, but in some ways we've been very fortunate that many people now can do meetings such as this without actually having to leave their home. But moving forward as a society, it's not a sustainable solution. So I'll leave my comments there. Great to see you.
Thanks, Greg, and great comments. I agree with a lot of it, and I won't go into all of it because I've been kind of droning on with my answers. But I agree. We don't want tokenism. We want inclusion and equity for the right reasons. However, just as I have, I think, evolved my thinking around disability and access and the need for carrot versus stick, or stick versus carrot, as I am now at that stage, understanding. I think similarly, we need that when it comes to inclusion and equity. We won't get there if we don't push it. And that's going to make people uncomfortable at times. And it's going to, in some ways, alienate another group of people, which is by no means the intention. We have these discussions at my dinner table and don't always agree. But the reality is, it hasn't happened organically. So it's time to push a little harder. And that is true for disability, but it's also true around diversity and inclusion more broadly when it comes to culture and ethnicity, and ensuring that we're hearing all voices. Now, does that mean that every board and every circumstance has to have a certain makeup of polka dotted people and striped people and what? No, I don't think it does. But we do have to do something to shift the balance and to ensure that we are creating spaces that welcome all people. And I see Manpreet on the screen, and she's an expert in this field. So if anybody needs advice, go to her. But it is work that we all have to do together, and we all have to be more conscious of it. And certainly for me, disability and women are a natural level of consciousness. For someone else, they're not going to be. But that's when you have to step outside yourself and say, okay, Stephanie, I don't know what it's like to be a person of color in our society. I need to ask for help there. I need to ask for help in understanding. I need to ask for help in broadening my understanding and expectations. That's a process. We can get there, and I think we will. And I'm maybe ever hopeful that, like you say, there are all sorts of technologies and things we've learned through the pandemic that are helping. I'm also worried about those. AI can also discriminate against people with disabilities quite quickly and easily, more so than even human bias, which we have to be really aware of. There's all sorts of things we need to do. But the more we talk about it and are aware of it and make a conscious effort to overcome it, we will start to see progress. And we just have to keep pushing forward.
So Linda and Tomas are going to speak one after the other, and then Stephanie, you can respond. So Linda first. No problem.
Hello, everyone. Stephanie, thank you for spending the time with us today. I've been sort of reflecting as I'm listening to everybody else talk here, and you pretty much have all said most of everything that I kind of wanted to bring up. And I'm listening to you, Stephanie, talk about your hotel situation, and I'm kind of cringing because that's my level of expertise. I'm a hotelier, and I've been in this business for 40 years. And you're absolutely correct. Some of the barriers in hotels, older hotels that have been built previously that didn't have any code or any criteria for accessible rooms, have had to bear some cost of renovation, which really, when we look at it, cost is a huge barrier for everybody, and it really shouldn't be. And I really like, the saying you said, it should be thoughtful and not ugly. And you're absolutely correct. Why aren't there connecting rooms? Why are all of the accessible rooms on the third floor? Why aren't there suites? And then when we bring it down to the level of even the staff, to be inclusive in our industry, it really should be anybody who is qualified to do the job and wants to work should be the candidate for the job, not whether or not they have a disability, not due to their race, their color, their religion, their background, or their gender at all. So I'm totally with you all there. And I just sort of, when we talk about education, how do we really get there for everybody at the end of the day, and the employers, so they're not afraid to reach out, so that they're, and somebody used the word tokenism, and that you're absolutely correct there too. You don't need to have on your board or have to have a criteria of a certain number of people with disabilities, but to have the door open to allow those people access to employment, access to housing, access to entertainment, access to everything else that everybody else is so important. So how do we take away the fear barrier that employers have about bringing these people into the workforce, about being able to spend the money to make the place accessible for everybody else?
Yeah.
Like, sort of your thoughts on that.
Hey, Tomas, you're next.
Thank you, Anita, and hello, everyone. Stephanie, my name is Tomas Reyes, and I am actually the executive director for an organization that represents basically the family physicians in our region, in our community, I should say, in our community. And but I've been reflecting on everything that is being said, and so with the risk of opening a can of worms here, I need to ask about healthcare and equity and accessibility. But before doing that, I just want to reflect something very quickly. A few years ago, I actually had the opportunity to work with Anita and some other like-minded individuals on trying to change accessibility and equity in the workplace. And it was a neat project. It was actually a very neat project. And in reflecting on what happened at the end, and the outcome is that we didn't really change a thing. So it was a good project. It was actually a good attempt to create awareness and consciousness through like amongst the business community about the importance of being inclusive and kind of think of equity, and we didn't really change a thing. The same conversations we had, and how long ago was Anita? Like probably close more than 10 years ago, and now are exactly the same, which is really sad, I would say. And then coming back to healthcare, which is kind of what I represent nowadays, you may be aware that we are going into this plan of developing primary care networks for our communities. And this is something that started with the Liberal government, and the NDP just embraced it, and we're trying to implement across the province. And it's kind of a conduit and a venue to reach out to the population and try to reduce and hopefully close the gaps in terms of attachment to family physicians and primary care providers, but also equitable access to healthcare, particularly in primary care, and connection to the other sides of the system. So I've been hearing a couple of big topics like funding. So I think Marilyn mentioned about funding and how that's important to kind of provoke change. I also heard your comment about actually 20% of the population being, let's say, like struggling with some disability of some sort. I also heard about your comment about time to push a little harder. And so my question to you is really from the perspective of healthcare. When you think about healthcare facilities, you can argue that there is accessibility. You can, but and I know that there may be gaps, but you can argue that there's accessibility. What else can we do? And furthermore, how can we stop the what in my story is the system perpetuating that tokenism that it was mentioned before, and actually do the things that we need to do for the right reasons, rather just for kind of checking the box?
I think experience is a great teacher. And so for both of your questions, I think my answer is really the same. We have to require at the top that a lens be put on and that the questions be asked. And then if we don't know how to answer them, we need to ask for help. The help is very, very willing and able and available to go into organizations and help ask the questions about diversity, inclusion, and accessibility, all of those pieces. The help is there. People just have to ask for it. And I think, you know, healthcare is as much as it pains me to say this, is one of the worst places for accessibility. I have never been in a doctor's office that had a adjustable height examination table. Ever. I know of one, it's at Women's, but never in the community. Access to healthcare is actually a big issue for people with disabilities. Access to equitable healthcare. So there's room to improve there too. Even when you're setting up a clinic, have you asked the question, does the design and equipment serve everyone? You know, am I open to, do I expressly state somewhere on my website, for example, that if you're a person with a communication challenge, whether that be from that you're hard of hearing, deaf, require an interpreter, are blind, need assistance, that we are willing to act on your request. Being open about what may or may not exist is one of the ways to be accessible. Being aware that you have to ask the questions and provide people the opportunity to ask for what they need in a safe way is a way to provide accessibility and to open that conversation. When people have had that conversation with one or more patients, it starts to get easier for the next one. And they start to see their business or their place of work from a different perspective. I think one of the biggest challenges that continues is on the employment front, getting over unconscious bias. I believe most people, like 97% of people want to do the right thing and are open to doing the right thing. They may not know how, they may make mistakes. But one of the biggest challenges is that you can set a policy at the top and say, we are going to be an inclusive employer. We're going to make modifications to our business to be accessible and inclusive. But by the time it filters down to the front, do they have the capacity to make the right decisions. Do they themselves understand bias and so on? Are they making assumptions that are blocking the progress? And certainly from an employment perspective, I would argue that they are. Even with the most enlightened companies, people with disabilities have an incredibly difficult time getting in the front door. And examples of universities where people go to school and get a degree and then can't get an interview. So on the one hand, the organization has seen fit to and been able to accommodate and assist somebody with a disability to go through and get a credential, but then they themselves are not open to hiring that person. Their systems don't allow for that person to come in the front door. Those are the kind of things we need to examine. We need to ask questions, and we need to not be afraid of the answers. And that goes with accessibility too. If you're a developer and you're building a complex of office buildings and they have 2 stories and no way to access the second story from a wheelchair, you got to ask the question, are you limiting your market? Are you limiting your market of employees? Well, you are. And just because you don't think somebody with a disability will ever want to work in your machine shop does not make you correct. And it doesn't mean that the next person won't, or the next building buyer won't. So I think these are the things we need to ask. They're questions we need to ask at the front. They're questions we need to ask when grants go out. They're questions we need to ask when permits go out. They're questions we need to ask when we are hiring for a new position, or we are launching a new product, or we're building a new location. It's about all of us asking those questions. And we can only do that by continuing to advocate and share and talk about it and include it as something that's relevant to business.
Our next 3 speakers are Ann Nickerson, Manpreet, and Alexandra. Ann.
Anita, Anne actually sent her a question to me, so I'll be asking. Oh, here's Anne. Never mind.
Sorry, I had my video off and I was on mute. The question I have, I work as an equity, diversity, and inclusion practitioner. And the question I have is around gender equity. What 2 or 3 things do you think the current government is getting right in the work they're doing related to gender equity? And what improvements, even a couple, would you say that need to be made?
Okay, thank you for that. We'll respond shortly. Manpreet, and then Alexandra, and then Stephanie, over to you.
Hi, Stephanie, nice to see you.
Hi.
One of my questions, one of the things that I always take into consideration is I love the conversation around accessibility and gender equity, but how are we looking at it from an intersectional lens? When we think about people with, from immigrant backgrounds or people of color, they're actually experiencing, Indigenous and Black, they're experiencing these challenges a little bit more than others. And so what are some of the ways that the government's doing things, or how can we support to help create change there as well?
Alexandra? Alexandra Osorio. Okay, Hannah, do you want to go next?
Hi, Anita. Thank you very much for hosting. And hi, Stephanie. Nice to see you. I know there's still a number of people that would like to pose some questions to Stephanie, and I do have an opportunity to dialogue with her next week. I guess my questions are not out of line with what Anne wanted to speak to, which is really about pay equity. We know that there is quite a disparity, and particularly I see it more so almost in the social services sector, which is the sector that I'm in currently. Most of the people that work in the sector are females, and the males tend to be in the CEO roles of larger charitable organizations where you do see quite a disparity there. So I know that you have been lobbying for equity in terms of pay, and I appreciate the work that you're doing there and continue to do there, but maybe if there's anything you want to update us on that would be great. Thanks, Stephanie.
Stephanie, over to you for.
Okay, the meaty questions, and I won't be able to get to all of it because I'm conscious of time. But going back to what's government getting right, the fact that they have now decided that pay equity legislation is, or pay equity, pay transparency legislation, whatever form it comes forward in, is required, is a step in the right direction, I think. Similarly with the accessibility legislation, and they have committed to upgrading the building code, so that's a good thing. On the, and then on again back on the equity side, they've implemented gender-based analysis into what they're doing as a government. Up till now, I've asked questions about it and haven't gotten really clear answers about what has changed as a result of doing that, or what have they been finding. Because certainly, if they used that gender-based analysis when they were looking at, for example, putting out relief for COVID, we would have seen some different responses, I think, than what we saw. We saw across the board responses that worked for everybody, so to speak, but didn't necessarily take into account unpaid work or the added burden felt by women largely because of childcare responsibilities, etc., during that process. So, so I'm not sure that they have found the way to use the information in actually driving change in policy, but the fact that they've added that as a lens that they are applying to everything, I think is positive. What are they getting wrong? What is government getting wrong? It's not particularly this government over other governments, but at this time, they are the government in power, and women are facing disproportionate losses of jobs, and there is no attempt to right the ship in that regard. We know the importance of childcare. There's a lot of money going out the door, but the reality is that that isn't changing the landscape for people that didn't have childcare. It's changing the changes they've made in childcare has changed the landscape for people whose kids were already in care. It has made it more affordable, but it hasn't in any significant way added childcare in volume to the system. So I think there's work there. More complex, the intersectionality commentary, agree entirely, Manpreet, that just adds a level of complexity and from an experience level, another barrier in lots of ways, especially if people are new immigrants. It would be different for you, for example, than somebody who's just moved here as a refugee. So we have to always look at that stuff, I think. And one of the things I personally feel is I don't know the answer. I have to ask people who do. That's important, right? It's important for me to be reaching out and asking how do I best represent your experience? How do I ask questions about your experience? How do I get the right answers? And I think acknowledging what you don't know is important, and that's sometimes hard for people. God knows I do it a lot because I don't know a lot of things. But I think that challenge adds another barrier. But if we could start piecing away the pieces, whether that's visual diversity on boards and in management that help reflect for people themselves in companies and in the workforce, then the secondary issue for them, depending on how they define it, do they themselves define their challenge as the disability or as the ethnicity or the language challenge or the cultural challenge? Which piece is where in the particular person's circumstance? So I think we just have to be aware and look to find ways to constantly improve and be open to learning.
Thank you. The next three and final speakers are Linda Cunliffe, Nazia, and Jess Root. So Linda. over to you.
Thank you, Anita. Congratulations, Stephanie. It's really good to see you. And the conversation has been, it's been really great. So some of the questions I had have already been answered. I guess as an organization serving women, as Sir Optimus are, we're, you know, international women's service organization. One of the conversations that keep coming up in our meetings and in the women we serve in the organizations we support is still affordable housing. It's just a huge barrier to a lot of women. COVID hasn't helped matters any. Like you said, a lot of women have either lost their jobs because they may have to be home with their children, homeschooling, or you know, the daycare is not available. Even women who are leaving the transition homes to move into their own new life are not being able to find affordable housing that is safe. And so that's, I guess, I like what you said about asking the right questions, because we don't always do that. And so what are the right questions we have to be asking, and who should we be asking them to?
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that, Nina?
In just a moment. Nazia and then Jasrup. Nazia.
Good morning. Can you say Nazia or Nazia?
Okay, Jasrup, over to you then.
Oh, hi.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, here we go.
Sorry, it took me a while to unmute. So, I'm Nazia Niazi. I live in Surrey. Oh, can you hear me? I'm trying to, sorry, I'm just having trouble with the controls here. There we go. So I represent so many different subsets of the community. I am a woman of color. I'm an immigrant. I'm a physician who works in Surrey and advocates for my community. My question would be regarding accessibility of all these different subsets. So when we talk about providing access to patients and inclusivity, and we talk about, for example, height adjustable exam beds, we know that a family physician in the community can't afford those because they just cost so much. And somebody who's starting to practice in the community cannot afford a $25,000 bed while they're investing to start a practice and kind of be financially secure and still have lots of student loans to pay. There are lots of questions, and we need to be really creative in problem solving and providing access. My question would be that, what would you propose in providing access to all these different subsets of people in a timely way? Because we've been seeing problems, we've been problem solving. How would we want to do that? How would we think outside the box to kind of answer this question?
Sure. Really quickly, to Linda first. Linda, you're absolutely right. Access to housing is an ongoing issue, certainly an issue for a lot of people in our region, and we know that for all sorts of reasons. But I think the bigger question there is, when we are developing programs or services or grants or whatever, who are we designing those for? I would argue that when it comes to many things in society, we are designing for men. And that isn't meant to be sexist. It's the reality. Women experience the world differently. I mean, even counter height. When we talk about the average counter height, it works for a man. Women would actually ergonomically be better with a slightly lower counter height because they are lower. They're physically smaller generally. But our world has always been designed that way. And what we have to start doing is start saying, when we're designing a solution, for example, addictions treatment, are we funding addictions treatment just generically, or are we funding addictions treatment that works for women. Because if you're funding addictions treatment that works for women, you have to consider the fact they may need to bring their children with them. And we aren't considering that when we're funding these programs. So I think government has to ask some different questions. And I think that the community can help government ask those questions by making sure that they are asking those same questions of the services they deliver. Nazia, for you, the question is different. It was more strategic, I think, around the cost of some of the modifications. There is sometimes a cost, and there is sometimes a barrier that at a moment seems insurmountable. However, for example, every massage therapist I've ever seen has an adaptable table, an adjustable height table. So I would question that perhaps there's a market in the equipment supply field for somebody to develop something that's a little less expensive. You know, and we know that's possible. We know there are great innovators, and in Surrey, with Innovation Boulevard and the Health Tech District, maybe that's something they should do. You know, we can keep talking about these things because the reality is that not government writ large at all levels can't fund everything. Those costs have to be borne by society at large somehow. So either they're borne individually as we make choices, or they're borne by the taxpayer at large. I don't know. I don't know what the solution is for each thing, because then you're right. There are challenges and there are choices and there are trade-offs and all of those things. But we have to start asking those questions, and we have to start deciding. So, you know, for doctors, maybe doctors have to say to government, we need help with this. Then it isn't just the individual person with a disability searching madly and desperately to find a doctor that can accommodate them, but in fact, the healthcare system is doing the reach out on their behalf. So I think there's lots of ways to go about all of this, and there are lots of people, as we can see just from you here today, asking the questions and caring enough to be here, that we'll do it. We'll get there.
Stephanie, thank you so much for being with us today. We've hit the 12 o'clock mark, and Jasrup and I will connect with you separately on the other items. And everyone, we're all in it together to make Surrey an opportunity city with our government partners. And thank you so much for your feedback. Make it a great business day.